How accurate is GTA 4 starting with geography? Now, we all know GTA isn't trying to be a one-to-one recreation, but still, let's check this out. First off, let's talk about the overall layout. Liberty City is basically a compressed version of New York, with elements from other nearby cities thrown in for good measure. The game world is split into 4 main boroughs, mirroring NYC's setup. You've got Algonquin standing in for Manhattan, Broker for Brooklyn, Dukes for Queens, and Bohan representing the Bronx. Sorry, Staten Island fans, looks like you got left out this time. Algonquin is where things get really interesting. Rockstar did a solid job cramming in a ton of NYC landmarks and neighborhoods. You've got your Central Park equivalent with Middle Park, Times Square becomes Star Junction, and the MetLife building transforms into the Rotterdam Tower. It's like a greatest hits album of Manhattan packed into a smaller space. Moving on to Broker, you'll spot some familiar Brooklyn vibes. The Broker Bridge is clearly inspired by the iconic Brooklyn Bridge, and areas like Outlook Park give you that Prospect Park feeling. It's not a perfect match, but it definitely captures that distinct Brooklyn atmosphere. Dukes and Bohan might not be as instantly recognizable as their real-world counterparts, but they still bring some authentic outer borough energy to the table. Dukes has that quieter, more residential Queens vibe, while Bohan carries some of the grittier aspects associated with the Bronx. Now, let's talk about the water. The West River and Humboldt River surround Liberty City, standing in for the Hudson and East Rivers. And yeah, you've even got your Liberty Island with the Statue of Happiness, Rockstar's cheeky nod to Lady Liberty herself. One thing that really stands out is how Rockstar nailed the feel of NYC's diverse neighborhoods. You've got your fancy high-rise areas, industrial zones, bustling commercial districts, and everything in between. The transitions between these areas feel natural, just like when you're walking through the real New York. But let's keep it real. This isn't a perfect recreation. The scale is way off, with distances severely compressed. In GTA 4, you can drive from one end of Manhattan to the other in just a few minutes. Good luck pulling that off in real life. Even with zero traffic, some iconic NYC elements are also missing or changed up. There's no Broadway cutting diagonally through the city, and the subway system is pretty simplified compared to the real deal. But honestly, given the limitations of game design back then, it's pretty impressive how much they managed to pack in. At the end of the day, GTA 4's Liberty City isn't trying to be an exact copy of New York. It's more like a love letter to the city, capturing its essence and attitude while taking some creative liberties. For gamers who've never been to NYC, it gives you a taste of that Big Apple energy. And for New Yorkers, it's a fun, twisted mirror version of home that's just familiar enough to feel right. Next, culture accuracy. So, Liberty City in GTA 4 drops us into this world that's clearly feeling the aftershocks of a major terror attack. The game never explicitly mentions September 11th, but man, you can feel it in the air. There's this underlying tension that runs through the whole city, and it's pretty spot on for how NYC felt in those years after the attacks. One of the first things you notice is the beefed-up security everywhere. Cops are on edge, there are checkpoints scattered around, and you've got that constant feel of being watched. It's like Rockstar took the real-world paranoia and cranked it up to 11. In reality, New York did see a major increase in security measures, but the game takes it to that exaggerated GTA level. The radio chatter and pedestrian conversations are where you really pick up on the social commentary. You'll hear people talking about terror threats, government overreach, and loss of privacy. It's like walking through New York and catching snippets of convos on the street. Everyone's got an opinion, and tensions are running high. The game also nails the way fear can be manipulated. You've got the LCPD using the threat of terrorism to justify some pretty extreme actions, mirroring real-world debates about security versus freedom. It's not exactly subtle, but then again, GTA has never been about subtlety. Now let's talk about the cultural melting pot aspect. Post 9/11 New York saw a rise in both unity and division, and GTA 4 doesn't shy away from showing this. You've got communities coming together, but there's also increased suspicion and prejudice. The game's protagonist, Nico Bellic, being an immigrant, lets players experience some of that firsthand. The economic aspect is interesting too. Liberty City is shown as a place of opportunity, but also intense struggle. especially for newcomers and lower-income folks. This mirrors the real New York, where the post-9/11 era saw both economic challenges and resilience. One thing the game captures really well is the city's resilience. Despite all the fear and tension, Liberty City is still this vibrant, bustling place. People are still living their lives, chasing their dreams, and talking smack to each other on the streets. It's that New York tough attitude that really shone through after 9/11, and GTA 4 nails it. The game also touches on the media's role post-9/11, with its parody news stations and over-the-top reporters. It pokes fun at how fear was often sensationalized and used for ratings, which, let's be real, wasn't too far off from what actually happened in some cases. One aspect that's maybe not as accurate is how quickly everyone in the game seems to resort to violence. Real post-9/11. New York actually saw crime rates continue to drop. But hey, it wouldn't be much of a GTA game if everyone was just chilling and getting along, right? In the end, GTA 4's portrayal of post-9/11 New York is like looking at the city through a funhouse mirror. The core elements are there, next the underworld. To be honest, GTA 4 does a pretty solid job of capturing the diverse nature of New York's criminal landscape. Just like the real Big Apple, Liberty City is a melting pot of different gangs and crime families. You've got your traditional Italian mafia, Eastern European gangs, African-American crews, and Latino organizations. This mix is pretty on point with the actual NYC crime scene. Let's start with the Italian mob. The game's Ancelotti and Pegorino families are clear nods to the infamous Five Families of New York. The way these organizations operate in the game, with their hierarchies, territories, and various rackets, is a pretty good reflection of how traditional Cosa Nostra operated. However, the game kind of exaggerates their power and influence. By the 2000s, the real Italian mafia in New York had taken some serious hits from law enforcement and wasn't quite as dominant as portrayed in the game. The Russian mob in GTA 4, represented by the Faustin Raskolov organization, is an interesting one. The game nails the rise of Eastern European criminal groups in New York during the 90s and early 2000s. These guys being involved in everything from protection rackets to human trafficking is sadly pretty accurate. The volatile nature of the Russian gangsters in the game also mirrors some real-world tensions within these groups. When it comes to street gangs, GTA 4 gives us crews like the North Holland Hustlers and the Spanish Lords. These are stand-ins for real-life gangs like the Bloods, Crips, and Latin Kings. The territorial nature of these gangs and their involvement in drug dealing is pretty spot on. However, the game simplifies the complex web of alliances and rivalries that exist in real street gang culture. One thing GTA 4 gets right is the multi-ethnic nature of modern organized crime. The game shows different groups working together when it's profitable, which is pretty true to life. In the real New York, you'd see unlikely alliances forming all the time based on mutual benefit. The Albanian mob in the game is an interesting inclusion. While not as prominent as some other groups, Albanian criminal organizations did gain a foothold in New York, especially in the outer boroughs. The game's portrayal of them as aggressive up-and-comers is pretty accurate. Now, let's talk about the Irish mob. In GTA 4, they're represented by the McCreary family. While the Irish mob was once a major player in New York crime, by the 2000s, their influence had waned significantly. The game's portrayal of them as a dying breed clinging to old glory days is actually pretty accurate. One aspect that's a bit off is the scale of violence. Don't get me wrong, organized crime in New York has certainly seen its share of bloodshed. But the constant shootouts and explosions in GTA 4 are more Hollywood than reality. Real organized crime often tries to keep a lower profile to avoid heat from the cops. The game also exaggerates the level of corruption in law enforcement. While police corruption has certainly been an issue in New York's history, by the 2000s it wasn't nearly as widespread or blatant as GTA 4 portrays. Something the game does capture well is the entrepreneurial nature of organized crime. You see the various groups branching out into legitimate businesses as fronts, which is a real tactic used by criminal organizations to launder money and create a veneer of legitimacy. One thing that's missing is the increasing role of technology in organized crime. By the late 2000s, real criminal organizations were starting to use more sophisticated methods involving cybercrime, which isn't really reflected in the game. The international connections of these crime groups are somewhat downplayed in GTA 4. In reality, New York's criminal organizations often have ties spanning across the globe, something the game only hints at. Lastly, the game doesn't really touch on the growing influence of Mexican cartels in New York's drug trade, which was becoming a significant factor by the late 2000s. Continuing with how GTA 4 portrays the different ethnic and national groups in its version of New York. See, New York City is one of the most diverse places on the planet, and GTA 4 does try to reflect that. According to the 2000 US Census, which would have been the most recent data when the game was in development, NYC's population was about 36% white, 27% Hispanic, 24% black, and 10% Asian. The game does make an effort to show this diversity. In GTA 4, you see a significant black population, especially in boroughs like Bohan based on the Bronx and parts of Brooklyn. This is pretty accurate. In real life, as of the 2000 census, the Bronx was about 36% black, and Brooklyn was about 36% black as well. The game's portrayal of African American characters ranges from street hustlers to middle-class families, which does reflect the diverse reality, although it tends to lean more heavily on stereotypes associated with lower-income neighborhoods. GTA 4 also includes a visible Hispanic community, with a mix of Puerto Rican, Dominican, and other Latin American characters. This tracks with reality. In 2000, Hispanics made up about 27% of NYC's population. The Bronx, which Bohan is based on, was actually about 48% Hispanic. The game captures some of the cultural elements, like the music and food, but it does tend to overemphasize connections to crime, which is a stereotypical portrayal. The game portrays various white ethnic groups, including Italian Americans, Irish Americans, and Jewish Americans. This reflects New York's history of European immigration. However, GTA 4 tends to focus more on the old-school ethnic enclaves, whereas by the 2000s, these communities were more dispersed throughout the city and suburbs. GTA 4 puts a lot of focus on Eastern European immigrants, particularly with the protagonist Niko Bellic and the Russian community. While there is a significant Eastern European population in NYC, it's not as dominant as the game portrays. As of 2000, Russians made up about 1.6% of NYC's population, with other Eastern European groups adding to that number. The game exaggerates their influence and connection to organized crime. Asian Americans. This is where GTA 4 falls a bit short. Asian Americans are underrepresented in the game compared to their actual presence in NYC. In 2000, Asians made up about 10% of the city's population, with significant Chinese, Korean, and South Asian communities. The game doesn't really reflect this diversity or the important role these communities play in New York's culture and economy. GTA 4 includes some Jewish characters and references, which is fitting given New York's large Jewish population. As of 2002, about 972,000 Jewish people lived in New York City. The game's portrayal is a mixed bag, sometimes falling into stereotypes, but it does acknowledge the community's presence. The game includes characters of Jamaican descent, which is cool because it recognizes the significant Caribbean population in NYC. In real life, as of 2000, about 546,000 people in NYC were of West Indian ancestry, with Jamaicans being one of the larger groups. This is another area where GTA 4 falls short. These communities aren't very visible in the game, despite growing populations in real-life NYC. As of 2000, there were significant Arab, Egyptian, and Moroccan communities in the city. The game does try to capture New York's famous diversity, but it definitely takes some liberties. It exaggerates some groups' presence and influence, like Eastern Europeans, while underrepresenting others, like Asians. It also tends to lean into stereotypes for comedic effect, which can be problematic. One thing GTA 4 does capture is the way these different groups interact in the city. you see a mix of tension and cooperation, which does reflect the complex social dynamics of real-life New York. The game shows how these communities live side by side, sometimes clashing, sometimes blending. Next, the car scene. GTA 4 feels a lot like hitting the real streets of New York, with Rockstar doing a solid job capturing that distinct Big Apple vibe. Just like the actual city, you've got this wild mix of rides, from rattling old beaters to flashy sports cars, all jammed up together on crowded streets. The game nails that NYC essence with its diverse array of vehicles, even if they're all parodies of real-world cars. You've got your stallions standing in for Mustangs, Infernuses channeling Lamborghinis, and of course, those iconic yellow taxis based on Ford Crown Victorias, the real kings of New York streets in the 2000s. Speaking of taxis, GTA 4 gets major props for nailing the look of New York's cab scene. Those Crown Vic-inspired yellow cabs were spot on for the era, dominating the real NYC until the city started pushing for greener rides later in the decade. The LCPD cruisers are equally on point, mirroring the Ford Crown Victoria police interceptors that the NYPD rolled with back then. It's these little details that really sell the New York vibe. Rockstar didn't forget about the beaters either. Liberty City's streets are dotted with older, beat-up cars, which is true to life for NYC, especially once you head out to the outer boroughs. But the game does crank up the luxury factor a bit. While you'll definitely spot high-end rides in areas like Manhattan, GTA 4 probably throws more fancy cars at you than you'd see in real life. Let's be real. You're more likely to dodge a Prius than a Porsche on most New York streets. The game includes a fair share of SUVs, reflecting their rising popularity in the 2000s. But it might go a little heavy on the larger trucks. Those massive rides aren't as common in the tight squeeze of city streets. One thing GTA 4 missed the mark on was the hybrid trend. By the late 2000s, Toyota Priuses and other eco-friendly cars were becoming a more common sight, especially in the taxi fleet. But they're pretty much absent from Liberty City. While we're talking about missing pieces, the game doesn't really show the prevalence of car services like town cars and limos, which were a big part of how business types got around Manhattan. And let's not forget about the ease of finding exotic cars just parked on the street in the game. That's a bit of a stretch compared to real NYC. But hey, GTA 4 nails some other quintessential New York driving experiences. The constant battle for parking spaces? Check. The stop-and-go traffic that makes you want to tear your hair out? Double check. Though the real deal can make Liberty City's gridlock look tame in comparison. And while they're not cars, the game's portrayal of those clunky, graffiti-covered subway cars and buses adds another layer of New York authenticity. After all the analyzing and research, I'll give GTA 4 8 out of 10 for accuracy. Pretty solid work and research done by Rockstar to bring New York to the life. Now, if you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.